The room was heavy with the scent of roses and old wood, the kind of smell that clung to you like a memory. I stood at the very back of the church, my hands sweating against each other, trying not to ruin the small program folded between my fingers. Stuart was standing at the altar, tall and handsome in a dark suit that looked like it had been sewn straight onto him. His smile stretched wide, but I could see the way his fingers drummed nervously against his thigh. Janet hadn't walked down the aisle yet, and for a second, it felt like the whole world held its breath. I was clapping. Everyone was. When Janet finally appeared at the heavy wooden doors, the crowd rose to their feet, and the applause rolled through the room like a slow tide. She was beautiful, of course, almost painfully so. Her hair was pinned up in soft curls, her dress sleek and simple, but somehow grand at the same time. I clapped because everyone else did. I clapped because it was expected. I clapped because, if I didn't, someone might notice how hard it was for me to even move. Janet's eyes scanned the crowd once, maybe twice, before fixing back on Stuart. He smiled in that way people do when they think they're winning something, and my chest ached a little. I wondered if he noticed how tightly she clutched her bouquet, how she blinked just a little too fast. Next to me, Annie sniffed quietly into a crumpled tissue. She was radiant even with mascara streaking down her cheeks, her golden hair catching the afternoon sun through the stained glass. She nudged me with her elbow and whispered, "Don't look so miserable. It's a happy day." I gave her a hollow smile and looked back at the front where the ceremony had started. I didn't want to be here, but where else could I have been? Stuart had been my best friend since we were old enough to scrape our knees on the same sidewalks. I owed him at least my presence. The vows felt too long, the words too sweet. When the priest finally said, "You may kiss the bride," the crowd erupted again, and I clapped until my palms stung. Stuart kissed Janet with a kind of careful enthusiasm, like a man trying to prove something. I wondered if she noticed that too. The reception was a mess of sparkling lights, bad champagne, and forced smiles. I stood by the edge of the dance floor, nursing a drink that tasted like regret, when Annie found me again. She wore a soft pink dress that floated around her knees, her heels dangling from one hand. "You look like you're about to jump out a window," she said, leaning in close so I could hear her over the terrible pop music blaring from the speakers. Thinking about it, I joked, though the words didn't feel that much like a joke. She grinned and tossed her shoes onto a nearby table. "Come on. Stuart's busy being a newlywed. No one's watching. Let's dance." I hesitated, but Annie grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the center of the room. I wasn't much of a dancer, but Annie didn't seem to care. She twirled under my arm, laughing, and somehow that laugh cracked through the heavy weight in my chest. I found myself smiling, really smiling, for the first time that day. As the night wore on, Stuart and Janet moved from table to table, greeting guests, laughing at bad jokes, pretending that everything was perfect. I watched them out of the corner of my eye while Annie rested her head lightly against my shoulder. She smelled like vanilla and something warmer, something safer. When the music slowed, Annie didn't let go. She swayed with me under the fairy lights strung across the ceiling, her hand warm against my chest. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. "Yeah," I lied. She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. "You don't have to lie to me." For a long second, I thought about telling her everything. How I used to love Janet. How I thought maybe she loved me too, once. How I lost both of them the day Stuart proposed. And I smiled and clapped like a damn fool. But instead, I just squeezed Annie's hand and said, "Dance with me, just a little longer." And she did. The clock above the bar ticked away the minutes, but I didn't care. I was too busy spinning Annie in slow circles, her laughter bubbling up every time I tried to add some clumsy little move. I wasn't good at this, but somehow with her, it didn't seem to matter. It felt like we had this little bubble where nothing else could touch us. Not Stuart, not Janet, not the bruises I kept hidden under my smile. When the song ended, Annie tugged me toward the tables, where plates of half-eaten cake and abandoned glasses cluttered every surface. She plopped down onto a chair and patted the seat next to her. I sank into it, suddenly aware of how heavy the day had been. "So," Annie said, her voice teasing, "were you always this terrible at dancing? Or was that special for tonight?" I laughed, the sound surprising even myself. "I saved my worst moves just for you." "Lucky me," she said, grinning. But then her face softened, and she reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against mine. "You did good today, you know. Being here. It couldn't have been easy." I looked down at our hands. Hers were small, delicate, but strong somehow. I wanted to say something clever, but all that came out was the truth. "I'm not sure why I came." "Yes, you are," Annie said gently. "You came because you're the kind of man who shows up, even when it hurts." I didn't know how to answer that, so I didn't. I just sat there, feeling the warmth of her touch, the music fading into something softer, something almost tolerable. Across the room, Stuart caught my eye. He raised his glass in a silent toast, his new wife tucked against his side like she belonged there. I nodded back, my throat tightening. Janet looked beautiful, radiant in a way that felt untouchable, but there was something tired about the way she leaned into Stuart, something resigned. I wondered if anyone else noticed, or if they were too blinded by the perfect story they wanted so badly to believe. "You don't have to stay all night," Annie said, squeezing my hand once before letting go. "No one would blame you if you slipped out." "I might," I said, trying to smile. "But then I'd miss the chance to dance with you again." Annie blushed, a pink that crept up her cheeks and made her look even more stunning. "Well, we can't have that." The next song was another slow one, and Annie stood, holding out her hand. I took it without thinking, letting her lead me back to the dance floor. The crowd had thinned out. Most people had either left or collapsed into chairs, drunk on cheap wine and the illusion of happiness. As we danced, the world blurred into colors and soft sounds. I didn't think about Janet, about the years I spent waiting for something that was never really mine. I didn't think about Stuart, standing there with a new ring on his finger and a future already mapped out. I thought about Annie, her hands steady on my shoulders, her eyes warm and open. At some point she leaned in close and whispered, "You know, sometimes the people who leave weren't meant to stay. And sometimes the ones who stay, they're the ones who matter the most." I closed my eyes for a second, letting her words sink in. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had been chasing a ghost, a version of love that was never real. Maybe the real thing was standing right in front of me, laughing and dancing and choosing to stay. When I opened my eyes, Annie was smiling up at me, like she knew exactly what I was thinking. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled back. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The night drifted on, slow and sweet, and somewhere between the bad music and the bittersweet memories, I realized something important. Sometimes, clapping at someone else's wedding didn't mean you lost. Sometimes, it just meant you were finally free to find something better. And maybe, just maybe, that something better was already here. The stars had started to blink awake outside, the sky slipping into a deeper, quieter shade of blue. I found myself sitting on the stone steps just outside the reception hall. a half-empty glass resting loosely between my fingers. The music still floated out through the open doors behind me, but it was distant now, like a memory that hadn't fully formed. Annie sat down beside me without saying a word, her bare feet brushing lightly against the cool stone. She leaned her head back and stared up at the sky, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "Beautiful night," she said after a while. I nodded, following her gaze. "It is." For a few minutes, we just sat there, saying nothing. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy or uncomfortable. It just was. The kind that felt like it understood you better than words ever could. Annie broke the quiet first. "I always thought weddings were supposed to feel magical," she said, her voice low. "You know, like in the movies. Big speeches, happy tears, perfect endings." I chuckled under my breath. "You think this felt magical?" She turned to me, her eyes glinting with something between sadness and amusement. "No. I think it felt like real life." I took a slow sip from my glass, letting the burn settle in my chest. "Real life's messy." "Yeah," she agreed softly. "But sometimes messy is better than fake." I didn't know what to say to that, because deep down, I knew she was right. Stuart and Janet were the picture of a perfect couple tonight, but pictures lie. I'd seen the cracks, small, hidden, but there. Maybe no one else wanted to admit it yet, but I knew what it looked like when two people smiled for everyone but each other. Annie pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them. "Did you ever love her?" she asked, so casually that it almost didn't feel like a knife. There it was, the question that hovered over me all night, now dragged out into the open where I couldn't ignore it. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I did." She nodded like she already knew the answer. Maybe she had known for a long time. Maybe everybody had. "But she didn't choose me," I added, the words tasting bitter. "Her loss," Annie said simply, and something about the way she said it made my throat tighten. I looked at her, really looked at her, at the way the soft porch light caught the gold in her hair, at the way she didn't flinch from the hard things, the way she sat with me, even when she could have been inside pretending like everything was perfect. "You're good at staying," I said without thinking. Annie laughed, a soft, surprised sound. "Maybe I'm just too stubborn to leave." Maybe that's exactly what I need. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and for a moment, I thought she might pull away, laugh it off, or pretend she hadn't heard. But she didn't. She just smiled, a small, real smile, and reached over to rest her hand on mine. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The door creaked open behind us, and Stuart's voice floated out, calling my name. I turned, seeing him, silhouetted in the doorway, his arms slung around Janet's shoulders. They looked tired. Janet's eyes didn't sparkle the way they had when she walked down the aisle. Stuart was trying, but it showed. The cracks, the effort to keep everything stitched together. "Come back inside," he called. "We're doing another toast." Annie looked at me, and I could see the question in her eyes. Stay and pretend, or slip away into something real. I set the glass down on the step, stood up slowly, and then reached for Annie's hand. "Let's dance outside," I said. She smiled, sliding her hand into mine without hesitation, and under the open sky, without music, without witnesses, we swayed together in the quiet. Maybe I hadn't clapped for the right reasons earlier. Maybe I clapped because I thought I was supposed to. But right now, holding Annie close, I knew exactly why I was standing here. Because some people leave and some people stay, and this time I was choosing the one who stayed. Annie leaned her forehead against mine, and for a long while, neither of us moved. The distant sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from the reception hall barely reached us out here. It was just the two of us, breathing in time, wrapped up in something simple and quiet and safe. "You're shaking," she whispered. I hadn't even realized it. My hands trembled just a little, the way they sometimes did when too many emotions tried to crash out of me all at once. I tightened my grip on her waist, grounding myself in her warmth. "I guess tonight's harder than I thought," I said, voice rough. Annie tilted her head back to look at me properly, her blue eyes clear even in the dim light. "You don't have to pretend you're okay. Not with me." The lump in my throat grew bigger. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She pulled back slightly and tugged my hand. "Come on," she said. "Let's get out of here for a bit." I followed her, without question, leaving behind the soft music, the clinking glasses, and the ache of everything I was supposed to celebrate. We cut across the dark lawn, the grass damp and cool beneath our shoes. Annie led me toward the old tree that had stood behind the hall for as long as anyone could remember. Its branches stretched wide, like arms waiting to catch whoever needed shelter. We sank onto the ground beneath it, Annie tucking her dress around her legs and leaning back on her hands. I sprawled next to her, feeling the earth firm and solid under my palms. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just listened to the wind rustling the leaves overhead, the soft hum of the world still spinning, even when ours felt paused. "You loved her a long time, didn't you?" Annie said finally, not looking at me. I stared up at the stars poking through the navy sky. "Yeah, longer than I should have. Funny thing about love," she said, twisting a blade of grass between her fingers. "Sometimes you love the idea of someone more than who they really are." I let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, maybe I was in love with who I thought Janet could be, not who she actually was. Annie was quiet for a moment, then said, "She was never going to choose you, even if Stuart hadn't been there. She was never going to stay." The truth of it hit like a slap. But it wasn't cruel. It was freeing. I'd spent so long wondering what I'd done wrong, what I hadn't been enough of. But maybe it wasn't about me at all. Maybe it never had been. "You think that's why it hurts so much?" I asked, because deep down I knew. Annie nodded slowly. "You lost something you never really had. And that kind of loss, it leaves a different kind of scar." We sat there, two broken pieces fitting strangely perfectly side by side. I turned my head to look at her, at the way the moonlight kissed her cheekbones, the way her hair curled slightly in the damp night air. "You stayed," I said again, softer, this time. She shrugged, a small, almost shy movement. "Some people are worth staying for." Before I could talk myself out of it, I reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her breath hitched, just slightly, and when her eyes met mine, there was something in them that made my heart pound against my ribs. I leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She moved closer too, until our lips met, in a kiss that was soft and searching, a question and an answer all at once. It wasn't the kind of kiss that lit fireworks or spun the earth backward. It was the kind of kiss that stitched broken pieces together, that whispered, "I'm here. I'm not leaving." When we pulled apart, Annie rested her forehead against mine again, her smile small but fierce. "You're not losing anything tonight," she whispered. "You're finding it." And for the first time in a long, long while, I believed it. The night grew cooler around us, the stars thickening above like a blanket of tiny, scattered promises. I lay back on the grass, my hands folded behind my head, and Annie curled up beside me, her head resting lightly against my shoulder. I could feel her breathing, slow and steady, syncing with mine. For a long time, we didn't say anything. We didn't need to. Everything important had already been spoken without words. The way her fingers had found mine, the way she hadn't let go. Inside, the reception was winding down. I could hear the occasional shout of laughter, the last scraps of a celebration trying to burn out before morning took it away. I thought about Stuart and Janet, and wondered if they even noticed I was gone. Part of me hoped they didn't. Part of me knew they wouldn't. You think they'll be happy? I asked after a while, my voice barely louder than the breeze. Annie shifted against me. Maybe. For a while. Just for a while. I turned my head toward her. She shrugged, her fingers tracing slow, absent-minded shapes on the sleeve of my shirt. Some people get married because they're in love. Others get married because they're afraid of being alone. Her words hit harder than I expected. I thought about the way Janet had clung to Stuart today, the way she smiled too big and laughed too hard. Fear had a way of dressing up like joy if you squinted hard enough. And what about us? I asked, half joking, half terrified to hear the answer. Annie smiled without looking at me. We're not pretending. I let the words settle between us. They felt right, honest, like a small flame flickering stubbornly against the dark. After a, wow, Annie sat up, brushing grass from her dress. Come on, she said, offering me her hand. I'm stealing you. Stealing me? I laughed, taking her hand and letting her pull me to my feet. Yeah, she said, grinning. You've given enough of yourself away tonight. It's my turn to take you somewhere better. Without another word, she led me across the lawn, away from the old hall and its hollow memories. We didn't rush. We walked slowly, the grass wet beneath our steps, the night wrapping around us like a promise. She led me down a little dirt path that twisted behind the gardens. I'd almost forgotten it was there. It was quiet, hidden, a place we used to sneak off to as kids, when the grown-ups' parties got too loud and the world felt too heavy. At the end of the path was a small clearing with an old swing hanging from a low tree branch. It was crooked now, the rope frayed at the edges, but it was still standing. Annie brushed the seat off and perched on it, her hands gripping the rope. She looked up at me with a challenge in her eyes. Push me, she said. I laughed and stepped behind her, giving the swing a gentle shove. She let out a soft laugh, tilting her head back as the swing creaked forward. I pushed again, a little harder this time, and soon she was flying back and forth, through the warm night air, her laughter spilling into the dark like music. I watched her, feeling something uncoil inside me, something that had been wound too tight for too long. She wasn't pretending to be happy. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just being, and somehow that was enough. When she slowed down, she twisted in the swing to face me, her feet dragging lightly against the ground. You know, she said, a mischievous glint in her eyes, you're allowed to be happy too. The words hit somewhere deep in my chest, sharp and unexpected. I crouched in front of her, resting my hands on the ropes beside hers. I'm working on it, I said. She leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. You're doing better than you think. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting her nearness soak in, letting it wash away the ache, the regret, the empty clapping, at a love that was never really mine. When I opened my eyes, she was still there, waiting. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid to stay. The air grew colder as the night deepened, but Annie didn't seem to mind, and neither did I. We stayed by the old swing, talking about everything and nothing. It was easy with her, the way conversation could slip from laughter to silence, without feeling awkward. She was a different kind of comfort, one I hadn't realized I was desperate for until now. Eventually, she hopped off the swing, landing lightly on her bare feet, and gave me a playful shove. "Your turn," she said. I laughed, raising my hands. "I'm too old for that thing." "You're not old, Stuart," she teased, grinning. "You're just scared you'll break it and look ridiculous." "Exactly," I said, but she grabbed my wrist anyway and pulled me toward it. Under her stubborn gaze, I sat down on the swing, feeling it creak under my weight. Annie stood behind me, her hands firm on my shoulders, and gave a light push. I didn't go far, just a gentle back and forth, like a child too cautious to fly too high. "See?" she said. "Not so bad." I shook my head, smiling despite myself. I wasn't sure when the world had gotten so heavy on my shoulders, but sitting there with Annie, it felt a little lighter. For the first time, it felt okay not to have it all figured out. After a few minutes, I slowed the swing with my feet and stood, brushing off my pants. Annie stepped closer, her hands smoothing imaginary wrinkles from my shirt. "You're different tonight," she said softly. "Different how?" "I don't know. Like, you're finally letting go of something you should have let go of a long time ago." I thought about Janet again, about Stuart and their perfect wedding photos, and the life they were supposed to start together. And then I thought about Annie, standing here in front of me, with no expectations, no demands, just herself. "Maybe I am," I said. Annie's smile faltered a little, like she was unsure whether she should ask the next thing on her mind. But she did anyway. "Did you ever tell her?" "Tell her what? How you felt?" I shook my head. "No. I figured if she didn't see it, if she didn't feel it herself, forcing it wouldn't change anything." Annie nodded slowly, stepping even closer, until there was barely an inch between us. "You deserve someone who sees you without you having to beg for it." Her words hit me so hard I almost staggered. God, how many nights had I spent twisting myself into knots, trying to be enough, to be the right one? How many smiles had I faked? How many silent claps had I offered while choking on my own heart? I swallowed thickly. "And you," she smiled, small and sure. "I see you, Stuart." It would have been so easy to ruin the moment with doubt or fear, to second-guess everything the way I always did. But tonight was about leaving the ghosts behind. Tonight was about choosing something real. I reached for her hand again, feeling her fingers slip naturally into mine. "Then maybe it's time I stopped chasing people who leave." She squeezed my hand gently. "And start dancing with the ones who stay." We stood there under the stars, the old swing swaying quietly beside us, the night pressing soft and forgiving around our shoulders. The boy who had clapped for someone else's happiness was still inside me somewhere, but he didn't feel so loud anymore. He was quieter now, softer, maybe even grateful for what he learned, for what he lost, and most importantly, for what he found. And maybe, just maybe, the man I was becoming could finally stop applauding things that hurt him and start building something better with someone who actually wanted to be there when the music faded. With Annie, with the girl who stayed. Morning was crawling up over the horizon by the time we made our way back toward the old hall. The first light broke gently over the fields, painting everything in soft golds and pinks. It made the worn walls of the building look almost beautiful. Again, less tired, less sad. Annie and I walked slowly, her arm brushing against mine with every step. I didn't want the night to end. I didn't want to lose this quiet space we had built together, where nothing else mattered but the way she smiled and the sound of her voice close to mine. As we got closer, we saw the cleanup crews already at work. Tables were being folded, decorations stripped down, floors swept of the night's chaos. The fairy lights that had seemed so magical hours ago now hung limp and lifeless, waiting to be taken down. In front of the building, Stuart stood talking to a few remaining guests, his tie loose around his neck, jacket slung over his shoulder. Janet wasn't with him. I noticed that immediately. It wasn't that he looked miserable. He didn't. He looked tired. Like someone who had crossed a finish line, only to find there was nothing waiting for him on the other side. He caught sight of us and waved, his face lighting up with a familiarity that made my chest hurt a little. No matter how complicated things had gotten, Stuart was still my oldest friend. I glanced at Annie. She squeezed my hand lightly, but said nothing. I let out a slow breath. "Give me a second," she nodded, stepping back toward the path we came from, giving me space without making me ask for it. I walked over to Stuart, hands in my pockets, trying to figure out what I even wanted to say. When I reached him, he clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. "There you are," he said, grinning. "Man, I thought you took off without saying goodbye." I shrugged, offering a faint smile. "Just needed some air." He laughed, a little too loudly. "Yeah, it was. A lot." I nodded, unsure if I was agreeing about the wedding or everything else between us. He studied me for a second, the grin slipping into something more real. "You okay, Stu?" I hated when he called me that. He'd been the only one allowed to when we were kids, but tonight it sounded wrong, like a jacket that didn't fit anymore. "I'm fine," I said. He looked like he wanted to say more, maybe dig into the pieces he could feel, but not name. But before he could, someone from inside called his name, probably Janet. He glanced over his shoulder and then back at me, the hesitation clear in his eyes. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "I know it's been weird. I know things got complicated." I looked him dead in the eye. "It's not complicated, Stuart. You chose your life. I'm just figuring out mine." He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, but I didn't need it. I didn't want it. I clapped him on the back once, firm, but not unkind. "Take care of her," I said simply. And then I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. Annie was waiting where I left her, her arms folded lightly across her chest, the early sunlight making her hair look like it was spun from gold. She smiled when she saw me, and just like that, the weight slid off my shoulders a little more. "All good?" she asked. "Better than good," I said. We didn't need to talk about it. She just slipped her hand back into mine, and we started walking. Again, away from the hall, away from the broken old dreams, and toward whatever came next. We didn't have a map. We didn't have a plan. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I felt found, because sometimes the people who promise you forever are just good at making noise. And sometimes the people who stay quietly, without promises or fanfare, are the ones who mean it the most. And I wasn't going to clap for someone else's happiness anymore. I was going to dance for my own. The sun rose higher, casting longer shadows across the fields, as Annie and I wandered toward the old gravel road that led out of town. My shoes crunched softly over the stones, but Annie didn't seem to notice. She walked barefoot, carrying her heels by the straps, like she'd left all expectations behind along with the night. We didn't talk much. There was a peace between us that didn't need words to fill it, just the sound of our steps, the occasional call of a bird waking up, and the hum of the earth stretching into a new day. At the bend of the road, I paused. From here, you could see the steeple of the old church, the edges of the reception hall, and the little town where we had all lived out the slow, sticky summers of our youth. It looked small now, smaller than I remembered, like something I could hold in my hands, and finally sat down. Annie turned to me, her eyes soft. "You're thinking about staying, aren't you?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at the town, again, at all the memories tangled up in it, some sweet, some sharp. I thought about the boy who had loved a girl who didn't love him back, About the man who clapped at her wedding, even when it broke him inside. About the way he'd finally, quietly, chosen to walk away. I don't think I need to stay here anymore, I said finally. Not to prove anything. Not to chase anything. Annie smiled and stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat of her, even through the cool morning air. Then where do you want to go? I looked at her, really looked, and felt something settle in my chest. It wasn't about the place. It was never about the town, the memories, the ghosts. It was about the people you chose to build a life with. It was about the ones who didn't need applause, who didn't need grand performances. It was about the ones who stayed. Wherever you are, I said simply. She laughed, this warm, low laugh that wrapped around me like sunlight. Good answer, Stuart. We kept walking, hand in hand. No destination but forward. Behind us, the town shrank into the distance. The reception hall emptied. The memories blurred at the edges. Ahead of us was nothing certain, nothing promised. But it felt right. We passed a weathered sign at the edge of town. The paint faded and cracked. Come again soon, it said. I smiled at it, almost fondly. No thanks, I muttered under my breath, making Annie laugh again. We kept moving, the gravel giving way to dirt, the dirt giving way to open road. The day stretched out before us, wide and wild and unwritten, and for once, I wasn't afraid of what came next, because I wasn't clapping anymore. I was dancing, I was staying, and this time, it was for real.